There is a pocket watch in this story, a gold case, Roman numerals, steel blue, hands frozen at some hour between 1969 and the moment a woman's trembling fingers lifted it from a wooden box lined with green velvet. The watch had not run in over 50 years. No one had wound it. No one had known it existed. And the woman holding it was not crying because of what it was worth, though it was worth more than most people's homes. She was crying because she understood all at once and completely that during every year she had spent believing herself forgotten, someone she had never met had been building something in silence. In a room that smelled of machine oil on a hillside the whole town called cursed. But that moment was still ahead of her, far ahead. To understand why those tears fell the way they did, you have to go back 65 years to a fabric shop in Monterey, California, and a girl who paid attention to everything. Nadine Ingrid Bancroft was born in the summer of 1955 in the back bedroom of her paternal grandparents' house, where the smell of cedar had soaked so deeply into the walls that no amount of repainting ever fully covered it. Her father, Harlan Bancroft, was a machinist at a manufacturing plant on the east side of town. He had large hands with permanent grease lines in the knuckles that no soap could reach, and a voice so soft that people often asked him to repeat himself, which he rarely did. Harlan was not a cold man. He was a man who had learned from his own father that love was demonstrated through presence, through labor, through the act of showing up at 5 in the morning every single day for 35 years without complaint, and he considered that lesson sufficient. He never told Nadine he loved her. He showed it by never missing a day of work so that the house had heat and the table had food and his daughter had shoes that fit. Her grandmother, Imogene Harlan's mother, had come to America from Stuttgart in 1928 with a suitcase and a recipe book, written in a hand so precise it looked like calligraphy. She kept those recipes pinned to the kitchen wall, her entire life yellowing cards in German that Nadine memorized without understanding the words the way children memorize prayers. Imogene changed the hand-embroidered curtains every spring, told stories of the old country every winter evening, and maintained a standard of domestic order that bordered on the architectural. Everything in her house had a place, a reason, and a history. Nadine's mother, Celeste, was of mixed heritage and had married Harlan against her own family's wishes. She carried that decision with a quiet dignity that Nadine recognized only decades later as one of the bravest things she had ever witnessed. Celeste expressed love through action, the hot meal on the table, the laundry folded with hospital corners, the hand that passed through Nadine's hair when she was sick, slow and warm, and saying everything that words in that household were not designed to carry. Nadine grew up between these worlds and absorbed from both of them a quality that would define her entire life: attentiveness. She was not a sad child. She was a serious one, serious in the way certain girls are when they watch everything, when they listen to adult conversations without pretending not to listen, when they hold on to the details that others let slip. Her father noticed it before anyone else. "Nadine has the eye of a watchmaker," he said once at dinner, not knowing that the comparison would become the most important sentence of her life. Nothing gets past her. In school, she loved science and English composition. She had careful, elegant handwriting that her teacher, Mrs. Odette, praised every time she collected essays, and that small, repeated recognition was for many years one of the few treasures Nadine kept close. At home, praise was scarce, not from cruelty, from habit, from the inherited belief that saying good things out loud might somehow undo them. At 15, Nadine began working afternoons at Mrs. Langley's fabric shop, 2 blocks from home. She folded bolts of cloth, organized spools of thread, helped customers choose patterns with the same focused care she brought to everything. The money she earned, she divided. Half to her mother, half into a tin box she kept under her bed, and counted every Sunday night before sleep. It was the only security she had, and she treated it with the seriousness of a banker managing a vault. It was at Mrs. Langley's shop on an October afternoon in 1974 that she first saw Garrison Ashford. He was 22, wearing a dark blue shirt, and he leaned on the counter with both elbows in a way that suggested he had never in his life been unsure of where to put his body. He had come in to buy linen for his mother. When Nadine asked how many yards he needed, he smiled as though the question were amusing for reasons only he understood. "You have the prettiest eyes I've ever seen on a fabric store girl," he said. Nadine did not return the smile. "I'm not a store girl, I'm an assistant." Garrison came back the following week, and the week after that, and the one after that. On the fourth visit, he asked to walk her to the bus stop. They dated for 2.5 years. Sunday afternoons at his parents' house letters when he traveled for work selling agricultural equipment, Friday night movies when both had money. Garrison was easy to talk to, charismatic. The kind of man who fills a room when he walks in and leaves a specific kind of silence when he leaves. Nadine was his opposite in every measurable way. Quiet where he was loud. Careful where he was impulsive. A saver where he was a spender. She believed at 19 that opposites complemented each other. She was young, she still believed that. They were married in March of 1977 at St. Philip's Church with 42 guests and a 3-tier cake her mother baked at home. Nadine wore a dress that grandmother Imogene had sewn over 3 weeks with lace at the sleeves and pearl buttons at the collar. When she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror that morning, she believed it was the most beautiful dress that had ever existed in the world. Her father gave her his arm and said nothing the entire walk down the aisle. But when he placed her hand in Garrison's, he pressed his daughter's shoulder with a firmness she understood as everything he had never known how to say. The first years were difficult in the ordinary way. A 1-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a kitchen where barely a 2-person table fit. Garrison changed jobs 3 times in the first year, from equipment salesman to sales representative to manager of a small distributorship. He opened with a partner who disappeared with the capital 6 months later. It was Nadine who paid the bills while Garrison recovered from the blow. She did not complain. She had made an unspoken agreement with herself. When she married, she would carry them both for as long as necessary without speaking of it, because speaking of it would diminish her husband, and diminishing her husband was something a wife did not do. Then came Estelle, Garrison's younger sister. Estelle Ashford. She was a family attorney, 5 years younger than Garrison, razor-sharp, immaculately dressed, and possessed of a certainty about the order of the world that left no room for people who did not fit her categories. Nadine did not fit. Nadine was a seamstress from a machinist family, and Estelle had never troubled herself to hide what she thought of that. The dinner happened 3 weeks after Garrison's business partner vanished. Garrison was still reeling. Nadine had quietly taken on extra sewing work to cover the rent. Estelle arrived unannounced on a Tuesday evening, carrying a bottle of wine and an opinion she had been sharpening for months. They sat at the small kitchen table. Estelle looked around the apartment with an expression Nadine recognized as appraisal, the kind that inventories and finds everything insufficient. Then she turned to her brother and said, as though Nadine were not sitting 3 feet away, "You need a wife with capital, Garrison, not a seamstress." The air in the room changed. Nadine's hand found the napkin in her lap and gripped it beneath the table until her knuckles ached. She looked at Garrison. He was looking at his plate. He said nothing. Not a word, not a glance in her direction, not the smallest gesture of defense. Estelle finished her wine and left. That night in bed in the dark, Nadine spoke. Your sister insulted me tonight. You said nothing. Garrison turned over. That's just Estelle. Don't take it personally. Nadine lay still for a long time after he fell asleep. She understood something that night that she would carry for the next 4 decades without ever naming it directly. Garrison's silence was not neutrality. It was agreement delivered without the inconvenience of having to own it. She never raised the subject again, but she remembered. In 1981, through a client she had begun sewing for at home, Nadine learned of a lot for sale in the Riverside Heights neighborhood. The owner needed to settle a debt, and Nadine had exactly enough in her savings for the down payment. She presented the idea to Garrison carefully, the way a woman in that era presented a man with his own idea gift-wrapped and handed back. Garrison embraced it as though it had been his from the start. They built the house over 4 years. Nadine sketched what she wanted on graph paper: the large kitchen, the backyard with space for a garden, the entryway with hardwood floors. They mixed concrete on sunny Saturdays and installed windows on rainy ones and painted walls on Sunday afternoons with the radio playing. When they moved in March of 1985, Nadine walked through every room alone before any furniture arrived, barefoot on the freshly laid floor, and cried in a way she could never fully explain. Not from sadness, from recognition. As though the house had been hers in some way that preceded the purchase, the construction, the years of saving and sacrifice that made it possible. Their son Grover was born in 1979, still in the apartment. Their daughter Lenore was born in 1982, when the house was halfway through construction. Nadine raised them the way her own mother had raised her, through action, through presence, through food at the right hour, and a hand on the forehead when there was a fever. She drove Grover to school every day and picked him up at 11:30. She took Lenore to ballet on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She helped with science projects with the seriousness of a professional. Garrison rarely attended parent-teacher meetings. He always had a meeting, a client, a trip. Nadine did not complain. She did it alone. Garrison Ashford was, to anyone watching from the outside, a reasonable husband. He did not hit. He did not drink to excess. He had no visible vice that might embarrass a family in public. But there was in him something subtler and far more corrosive, a fundamental inability to acknowledge what another person contributed. When Grover was accepted to the State University in 1998, Garrison threw a party for 20 people and gave a speech about the son who had made it. He did not mention that Nadine had sat beside Grover every night for 18 months, drilling calculus and chemistry, buying prep workbooks with her sewing money and studying them herself beforehand so she could explain the problems. When Lenore married in 2003, Garrison cried at the altar and appeared in every photograph. Nadine was there too, at the edge, slightly out of focus. In a blue dress she had sewn herself in 3 weeks. She made quilts. That was the detail anyone who knew her mentioned first. Not domestic sewing done out of necessity, but something closer to art. Patchwork quilts that took months to complete, each piece of fabric chosen with a logic only she understood. She had a sewing room at the back of the house, a small room Garrison sometimes used to store documents, but that Nadine had reclaimed with the quiet firmness that was her signature. There was a quilt she started in 1991 that was still unfinished the day she left. She left it behind. Grover sold the sewing machine along with the living room furniture when he renovated the property to rent it out. The marriage began to fall apart in 2012 when Nadine was 57 and Garrison was 61. Retirement revealed in Garrison a man Nadine did not recognize, or perhaps had always recognized but refused to name. He grew irritable over small things. He criticized the food he had eaten without complaint for decades. He stopped pretending gratitude for what he had never genuinely been grateful for. In 2015, he began coming home late without explanation. In 2016, Nadine found messages on his phone. She did not want to finish reading them. She read them. In 2017, at 62, Nadine filed for divorce. What followed was the most dehumanizing experience of her life, and she had sufficient experience with dehumanization to have a scale. Garrison hired an attorney who specialized in family law, and behind that attorney advising without appearing on any filing to avoid conflict of interest was Estelle Ashford, the same Estelle who had called Nadine a seamstress at a kitchen table 20 years earlier, now directed the legal strategy with surgical precision. Delay, complicate, drain. Estelle called Nadine once during the proceedings. Her voice was polished and cold. The Ashford family doesn't have a tradition of dividing assets with people who choose to leave Nadine. Accept the offer. It's more generous than you think. Nadine hung up without responding. The house in Riverside Heights, which Nadine had found, whose down payment she had made, whose construction she had overseen brick by brick, was titled in both names. But Garrison's lawyers built their case around income, around documented financial contribution, around a verbal prenuptial agreement that Nadine swore had never existed but could not prove hadn't. Grover sided with his father. Lenore tried to remain neutral and in the process was of no use to her mother at all. Nadine left the marriage in September of 2019 at 64 years old with a suitcase of clothes and $18,000. $18,000, her share of 43 years of contribution to an estate the court appraised at nearly $700,000. She signed the papers with a steady hand. She did not cry in front of anyone. She waited until she reached Maureen Driscoll's back bedroom, closed the door, and then she cried. Maureen Driscoll was Nadine's oldest friend. They had known each other since elementary school, 60 years of the kind of friendship that doesn't require explanation or maintenance. Just the knowledge that the other person exists and would come if called. Maureen was 64, had lived alone since her husband's death in 2008, and she treated Nadine with an uncomplicated generosity. Meals made together, utility bills split without being itemized, the television tuned to the soap operas Nadine liked. But generosity, however vast, does not transform a borrowed room into a home. Nadine woke every morning before 6 and lay still in the dark, aware of occupying space that was not hers, carrying to bed each night the sharp consciousness of being a burden in the life of someone who loved her too much to say so. She tried to work. At 64 in a city that had known her for decades as Garrison's wife, the options were few and offered in a tone that made clear what people now thought she was: a woman without options. She sewed at home for a few clients Maureen had referred. Repairs hemming a patchwork quilt a young client ordered that took 3 months and sold for $150. She saved every cent. In November of 2019, Grover came to visit. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon without calling, knocked with the confidence of someone knocking on a door that belonged to him, and sat in the corner chair where Nadine kept her bag without asking. He was 41 years old and had grown heavy in the way certain men do when life has treated them well for long enough. He looked around the small room without disguising what he thought of it. "You need to think about your situation, Mom. You can't stay here forever." A pause. "We've been looking into assisted living. There's a very nice place nearby. It has physical therapy activities." "Grover, I'm 64 years old, but I'm going to figure out my situation," she said, looking at him with a calm that she knew unsettled him. It always had. "Thank you for coming." Grover left and did not come back. Lenore called a week later to ask if Nadine had spoken with Grover about the proposal. Nadine said she had, and that she had her own plans. Lenore was silent for a moment, then said, "Okay, Mom," with a relief she did not even try to conceal. The relief of someone who had been ready to transfer a responsibility and had just learned the transfer would not be necessary. That was the last real conversation Nadine had with her daughter for months. By December of 2019, Nadine had $95,000 in her savings account. The remains of the settlement, plus everything she had managed to put aside in those first months. She counted it every week with the same discipline she had given the tin box under her bed as a teenager. It was the exact measure of everything she had in the world. On a Tuesday afternoon in early February of 2020, Maureen came home more animated than usual with a grocery bag and a story. She had spent the afternoon at the home of Nancy Briggs, a woman from church where she had run into Nancy's son-in-law, a real estate agent named Emmett Lockhart, who had mentioned without much conviction a property he had been trying to sell for nearly 2 years. A little house up in the hills. "Old German immigrant house on the hillside," said Maureen, unpacking onions on the kitchen counter. "People say it brings bad luck." She waved her hand. "Nonsense." "How much?" Nadine asked. Maureen turned. 85,000. Nadine went quiet. That evening, the phone rang. It was Margot Lockhart, Emmett's wife, calling Maureen. Margot was an active member of their church congregation and possessed the particular energy of a woman who believed that warning others about danger was not gossip, but moral duty. "Maureen, I heard your friend Nadine wants to see the house on the hill. You should tell her. The Petersons bought it in '95. The husband had a stroke 6 months later. The Torres family, their son died in an accident. The last owner went bankrupt. Everyone who touches that house ends in misfortune." Maureen relayed the call. Nadine listened, sitting at the kitchen table with her cold coffee. "Give me Emmett's number," she said. She called the next morning. Emmett Lockhart fell silent for a second when she said she wanted to visit. The silence of a man who had stopped expecting the phone to ring. He arranged a visit for Saturday. The days between the call and Saturday were the strangest Nadine had lived through that winter. What she felt was not hope. Hope requires an image of what you are hoping for, and she had none. It was more like gravity, something pulling without making a sound. Saturday morning, 5:30, brown slacks, the long-sleeved navy blouse she considered her visiting outfit. Coffee with toast. By 7:30, she was on the sidewalk waiting for the bus. The drive took 40 minutes. Nadine spent the entire ride watching the landscape change through the window. The suburban sprawl giving way to eucalyptus groves and steep hillsides. The vegetation thickening until it darkened the inside of the bus, and then the descent into the old town center. The air heavier and greener. The sky opening into a different kind of clarity. Emmett was waiting with his mud-caked car and a paper cup of coffee he offered with practiced courtesy. Gray-haired, thick glasses, dress, shoes on a Saturday. "You sure you want to see this property? Not hostile." The question of a man who had endured too many fruitless visits. "Sure," said Nadine. The car climbed the narrow road. Emmett told her about the curse without calling it that. The stroke, the accident, the bankruptcy. Nadine said, "I'm not superstitious." Emmett said nothing more. The car stopped at a curve where the vegetation opened, and Nadine saw the house for the first time. It was worse than she had imagined. The old wooden siding was blackened with moisture across half the facade. The roof was covered in moss and orange lichen. Two upstairs windows had broken panes taped over with darkened plastic. Vines climbed the porch columns as though slowly, patiently pulling the structure back into the hillside. A pomegranate tree had pushed its branches across the living room window. But the structure, the posts, the way the beams crossed at the corners, the proportion of the windows to the facade, There was a solidity beneath the decay that abandonment had not managed to erase. Inside old wood, moisture mold, and beneath it all, a persistent undertone of machine oil that seemed woven into the walls themselves. The hardwood floor creaked, but held, and on the far wall above the stone fireplace, a carved wooden mantelpiece. Nadine almost missed it. She was halfway to the kitchen when she stopped, turned back and looked closely. Someone had carved into the center of the mantel an open pocket, watch its hands marking 320, surrounded by oak leaves and miniaturized wooden gears, with a precision she had never seen in decorative woodwork. Every tooth of every gear had been cut individually. She counted without meaning to. 72 teeth across 3 interlocking gears carved from oak with nothing but a chisel. "Who made this?" she asked. Emmett appeared in the kitchen doorway. "The German who built it. Heinrich something. It's in the documents." Upstairs, in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, Nadine opened a corner window with effort, the wood swollen with moisture, and discovered that from this angle through the branches and over the rooftops, she could see a narrow strip of gray-blue horizon. She stood there long enough that Emmett came up to check on her. At the back of the kitchen, a metal door led to a separate room built of masonry, locked with a different padlock, newer, for which Emmett had no key. "I don't know what's in there," he said with the indifference of a man who had stopped being curious. 85,000, Emmett said. "Full property, about 2 acres. 60,000, said Nadine. Emmett looked at her. He calculated. Not her offer, she could tell, but the math of 2 years without a sale against the certainty of closing now. 70. 62. "And you get me the key to that room or the name of whoever has it?" Emmett nodded. Monday, she signed the papers. Wednesday, the deed was in her name. She had spent $62,000. She had $33,000 left. She called Maureen that night. "I bought the house." Silence. "It brings bad luck, Nadine." More silence. "Nadine, for the love of God." "Maureen, I know what I'm doing." She did not know exactly, but she had learned in 64 years that certain things are true before you understand why. 3 weeks to organize. She sold her portable sewing machine for $400. It hurt more than she expected, but the machine was heavy, and she could not carry it. She packed the clothes that would fit in the large suitcase, her documents in a clear plastic folder. The bus of loose photos she had brought from Riverside Heights, not the album, just photos inside a shoebox that Garrison had let go because it had no apparent value. She wrapped it in paper and placed it at the bottom of the suitcase beneath everything. Maureen drove her to the bus station on the morning of departure. A Tuesday in March, low fog, the kind that sits on a city like a hand pressing gently down. Maureen stayed in the car with the engine running while Nadine pulled her suitcase from the trunk. When she was done, the 2 women stood facing each other. 40 years of friendship concentrated in an instant that has no correct words. "You're crazy," said Maureen. Her voice was tight. "Probably," said Nadine. They embraced. Nadine took her suitcase and climbed onto the bus without looking back. Not from coldness, because she knew that if she looked, it would be very hard to keep climbing the steps. The bus left at 8:45. Nadine took the right side window seat and watched Monterey grow small. The buildings, the factories, the houses she had passed for decades without noticing. The backdrop of a life that was no longer hers. The landscape changed the way she had memorized, from the first trip suburban giving way to forest, the air thickening, the sky opening. But this time there was no Emmett on the other side, no visit to finish, no return bus to catch. This time the bus went to a point and she was staying. Through the window, between hills covered in forest far away, there was a piece of horizon. The taxi left Nadine and her suitcase at the edge of the dirt road, where the vegetation opened to reveal the house above, and the driver pulled away without asking if she needed help, which she did not and would not have accepted if offered. It was nearly 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and the light at that hour on the hillside had a quality she had not seen anywhere else. Not the warm yellow of the valley, but something diluted and damp touching everything from a low angle that made surfaces appear sharper and at the same time less real, as though the entire day were being filtered through water. The house was exactly as she had left it 3 weeks before. Worse, perhaps. Or perhaps simply more honest now that there was no return bus to soften what she was looking at. The blackened wood, the moss, the plastic taped over the upstairs windows, the vines working their slow grip on the porch columns, the pomegranate tree pressing its branches against the living room glass as though trying to get inside. Nadine pulled her suitcase up the irregular stone path. The stones were overgrown with tall grass on both sides and slick with moss in places. One or two had shifted and would need resetting, but they were solid. Someone had laid them with enough care to outlast decades of neglect. She took out the iron key, inserted it into the rusted padlock, and the lock opened more easily than on the first visit. The solid wood door swung inward with a low sound that was not a creak, but something deeper, like the exhale of a room that had been holding its breath. She dragged the suitcase inside, closed the door, and stood in the entry hall. The gray light from the front window, the rectangular marks on the walls where pictures had hung for decades. The carved mantelpiece above the fireplace with its frozen clock and its 72 wooden teeth. "All right," Nadine said aloud. She opened the front window as far as the swollen wood would allow, about 16 inches, enough for air to enter, and for the house to begin the long process of remembering what ventilation felt like. Then she began to explore the rooms again, this time without the pressure of Emmett waiting downstairs, without the awareness of a visit that had to end. This time she could stay in each corner as long as she wanted, and she did. In the living room beneath the grime, she found wallpaper. A geometric pattern in blue and cream, faded but intact over large sections, a design from the 1940s that no one manufactured anymore. In the corner near the staircase, what she had assumed was a cabinet turned out to be a display case made of wood and glass with brass hinges that still turned. 3 internal shelves lined with green velvet, thick and slightly lustrous, the kind used for jewelry or objects that must not be scratched. The velvet was faded and spotted but had once been fine. She noted it and moved on. In the kitchen, inside the double-door cabinet beneath the stone sink, she found a small wooden box, 8 inches by 12 with a press-fit lid. She carried it to the window light. The lid had a simple engraving at its center, a single gear, the kind found inside a clock, carved with the same precision as the mantelpiece. The box was empty, but its interior was lined with the same green velvet as the display case. She ran her finger across the fabric, felt its texture for a few seconds, then set the box aside and took it with her upstairs without knowing why. Night came quickly. The sky turned purple before 7. Nadine made the most minimal bed she had ever slept in. The $25 mattress pad on the floor of the larger bedroom. A sheet folded as a blanket because March nights on the hillside were still mild enough. Crackers, a bag of nuts, a bottle of water. She ate sitting on the windowsill, listening to the sound of wind arriving in waves through the trees below. Before sleep, she opened in the photo box. Grover as a baby in her arms, the house half built behind them. Lenore at 6 in her ballet costume, and grandmother Imogene at Christmas, white hair, pinned up striped apron, a mug of mulled cider in her hand, smiling the effortless smile of a woman standing in exactly the right place. Nadine touched the photograph with her thumb, then put everything back. She lay down. The house made sounds in the wind, specific sounds in specific places. The second stair-step of floorboard near the front door, something in the small bedroom that could have been the window frame, contracting in the cooling air. She listened without fear. They were the sounds of old wood doing what old wood does when no one is listening, breathing, settling, continuing. She slept better than she had in months. In the morning, she washed her face at the kitchen stone sink, the faucet dripping, but the pressure good, the water cold and clean. She looked at herself in the small mirror she had propped on the windowsill. 64. White hair cut straight at the chin, a job she had done herself for years. A face that carried the decades without any specific bitterness carved into it. Bitterness would require more time, and she did not intend to give it any. "Good morning," she said to the mirror. Then she went to find coffee. The Hillside Bakery was 500 steps down the hill on a corner, with a wide oak tree shading two plastic tables on the sidewalk. Behind the counter stood Jolene Travers, about 45, hair in a high bun, navy apron, rolling a pastry dough that filled the small shop with the smell of butter and cinnamon. When Nadine walked in and said she had bought the house on the hill, Jolene stopped rolling. She looked at Nadine with the open face of a woman who evaluates fast and decides fast. "The German's house," Jolene said, a silence that Nadine did not try to fill. "Everyone's gonna say it brings bad luck." "Everyone already has." Jolene studied her for a moment longer. Then she smiled a real smile, the first one Nadine had received in this town. "You're not short on courage, are you?" The cinnamon scone Jolene wrapped in parchment paper was warm in Nadine's hands as she carried it to the plastic table under the oak tree. She sat, she ate slowly, she drank the coffee. The morning was overcast, the breeze smelled of damp earth. It was the best breakfast she had eaten in 3 years, and the fact that it happened at a plastic table on a sidewalk in a town where she knew exactly one person struck her not as sad but as a beginning. Small, specific, and real. The trouble arrived in her second week. Thornton Standish was the kind of man who had found his purpose inside a rulebook and never saw a reason to look anywhere else. 58 years old, thin, wire-rimmed, glasses, clipboard in hand. He appeared on a Wednesday morning while Nadine was measuring the kitchen window for a replacement pane and introduced himself as the county building inspector with the formality of someone who considered his title a form of armor. "I've been informed that someone has moved into the Wingate property," he said, standing in the entry hall and looking at the walls with the expression of a man cataloging violations. "I need to conduct a habitability assessment before occupancy can be authorized." He spent 45 minutes walking through every room, making notes, taking photographs. He tested light switches. He pressed his thumb into the wood around the window frames. He stood on the second stair step and bounced slightly, frowning at the give. His conclusion was delivered at the front door with the clipboard held out so Nadine could read the form. Electrical system outdated and potentially unsafe. Staircase requiring structural reinforcement. Second floor windows not meeting emergency egress code. The house in its current condition did not meet minimum habitability standards. "You have 60 days to complete the required repairs," Standish said, "or you'll need to vacate." Nadine looked at the list. She looked at Standish. "Mr. Standish, I have $33,000. I will fix every item on this list, but I need time." 60 days, Standish said. "The code doesn't adjust for bank accounts." He left. Nadine stood in the doorway holding the clipboard form and doing the math. New wiring, staircase reinforcement, window frames, $33,000, 60 days, and a town that had already decided this house was a place where bad things happened to people who stayed. The math was not in her favor, but Nadine had spent 43 years doing math that was not in her favor, and she was still standing. She called the plumber, Mr. Valmore, the one Emmett Lockhart had recommended. He canceled the first appointment. Something came up, he said. Nadine heard in his voice the particular evasiveness of a man who had been told something by someone and did not want to say who or what. She called again. He came the second time, late apologetic in the way people are when they know their apology is insufficient, but hope it will be accepted anyway. She called Dalton, that young carpenter Jolene had recommended. Dalton hesitated. He had heard things, he said, about the house. Come see the house, Nadine said, then decide. Dalton came. He was 32, worked with reclaimed hardwood, and had the calloused hands and direct gaze of a man whose respect had to be earned through craft, not conversation. Nadine brought him to the living room and stood back. Dalton looked at the carved mantelpiece for a long time. He ran his finger along the gears without speaking. When he finally turned to Nadine, his expression had changed. "This is hand-carved oak," he said. "Every tooth cut individually. No machine, just a chisel and whoever had the patience to sit there long enough." He looked at the mantel again. "I'll take the job." Dalton replaced the window frames. Mr. Valmore fixed the pipes. An electrician Jolene knew rewired the ground floor and the staircase. Nadine worked alongside all of them, not because she had the technical skill, but because she had something more valuable: the ability to watch, to ask the right question at the right time, and to learn what she needed to learn without pretending she already knew it. And she did the work they could not charge for. 3 days on her knees scrubbing the living room walls with a brush and bucket, the water turning black and needing to be changed every 30 minutes until the Art Deco wallpaper in blue and cream emerged from beneath, decades of grime intact across 70% of the surface, a pattern from 1940 that no one made anymore, and that Nadine decided immediately to preserve rather than replace. On day 55, Thornton Standish returned. He walked through each room with his clipboard, checking items one by one. New wiring inspected and approved. Staircase reinforced with steel brackets beneath the treads, solid under weight. Windows reframed, opening to the required width for emergency egress. He marked each box. He signed the habitability certificate, placed it on the kitchen table, and stood for a moment looking at the carved mantelpiece, which Nadine had cleaned but not altered. "You kept this," he said. "Of course." "Good." He put his pen in his shirt pocket. "When I came the first time, I thought you would leave, like everyone else." A pause. "I was wrong." He extended his hand. Nadine shook it. It was the handshake of a man who had just revised an opinion he had held with certainty, and who respected the evidence that had forced the revision. Mr. Fairbanks appeared on a Monday in April. He was 68, retired, a widower of 3 years, with hands that carried decades of soil beneath the fingernails in the permanent way that comes from a lifetime of working with plants. He arrived with a shovel and pruning shears, walked into the overgrown front garden, and began cutting back the vines that had engulfed the base of a magnolia tree without asking permission or mentioning payment. When Nadine came out to ask what he was doing, he said without looking up, "Clearing the vine off this magnolia. You have to give it room to breathe." She brought him coffee. He stayed. Over the following weeks, Mr. Fairbanks identified beneath the decades of abandonment a garden that someone had planted with deliberation: the magnolia, a Japanese camellia that had grown crooked but was alive, 2 climbing rose bushes needing new support, a jasmine that had invaded the neighbor's wall, and along the stone path from the road to the door, a row of agapanthus, deep purple with a robustness that had withstood every year of neglect. "This wasn't planted casually," Mr. Fairbanks said one afternoon, pointing at the agapanthus with his pruning shears. "Whoever put this in knew it takes years to establish but lasts forever. They were planting for the long term." Nadine looked at the purple flowers and said nothing, but she thought of a man kneeling before a fireplace on Christmas night in 1945, carving wooden gears with a chisel, keeping time. Rosalind Wingate arrived on a Friday morning 3 days after Nadine's first week in the house. Nadine was sweeping mold from the living room walls with the door open when a small figure appeared in the doorway. 5'2", very fine white hair in a bun, with thin wisps escaping at the temples. Clear blue eyes magnified behind thick glasses. A cotton dress printed with small blue and white flowers over which she wore a cardigan buttoned to the second button. In her right hand an old leather bag. In her left a branch of white bougainvillea wrapped in craft paper. "Nadine," said the woman. "That's me." Rosalind Wingate advanced 2 steps into the living room and stopped. She looked around slowly, her magnified eyes moving from wall to wall, from the floor to the ceiling, from the staircase to the fireplace with an expression Nadine was a moment slow to identify. Not sadness, not nostalgia, recognition. The look of someone walking into a room that holds memories and finding them exactly where she left them. The same, Rosalind said more to herself than to Nadine. Dear God, the same. They sat in the kitchen with coffee on the plastic table. Rosalind spoke for 2 hours. She had been born in this house in 1941, she and her sister, Gertrude. Her grandfather, Friedrich Ernst Wingate, had built it in 1943 after the original house became too small. He had come to America from Stuttgart in 1932, not fleeing the Nazis but fleeing debt. The watch company had collapsed and his father owed half the city. Friedrich arrived with nothing. He learned English in 2 years, built his first workshop in 1935. He was a watchmaker of extraordinary skill, the best on the West Coast, people said. He came to the hills in 1940 because his wife Winifred had problems with her lungs, and the doctor said the mountain air would help. He bought the land with what he had saved and built the house in 2 years with his own hands and 2 helpers from town who never treated him as a foreigner, though he was one. He set up his workshop in the house rather than in town because during the war years, a German immigrant in America was wise not to appear too prominent. The workshop was the room behind the metal door, Nadine said. Rosalind's blue eyes focused on her with new attention. You've seen it. I haven't been inside. I don't have the key. Rosalind opened her leather bag with arthritic fingers that took a moment with the clasp. She withdrew a brown envelope, old hand folded with nothing written on the outside. She placed it on the table. The key is in here, she said, and a few other things my grandfather left with instructions to be given to the next owner of the house who came with the intention of staying. She looked at Nadine over her glasses. The others didn't stay. You are the first in 40 years. Why did the others leave? Because the house unsettles them, not from any curse. Because when you enter this house, you feel there is something here you do not yet understand, and people who do not understand prefer to leave. A pause. Did you feel it? I felt it. And you stayed. I stayed. Rosalind looked at her slowly as if that answer confirmed something she had been waiting decades to hear. Before leaving, Rosalind stood before the fireplace and looked at the carved mantelpiece for a long time. He made this carving on Christmas night 1945, she said without turning around. I was 4 years old. I woke up and came downstairs to see what he was doing. He was kneeling before the fireplace with a chisel in his hand, and he didn't know I was behind him until I asked. Then he turned and looked at me and said, Rosalind, I am keeping time. She was quiet a moment. I never understood what he meant until I did. She left with her careful steps down the stone path around the curve of the dirt road and out of sight. Nadine closed the door, returned to the kitchen, sat at the plastic table and opened the envelope. Inside were 3 things: a small brass key with a head shaped like a gear with 6 teeth, a hardcover notebook, black half-letter size, with the name Friedrich Ernst Wingate written in very small, very precise handwriting on the first page. and a letter. The letter was written in English that still carried the architecture of German, beneath it constructions that placed the verb at the end of the clause on paper that had once been white and was now pale yellow with edges grown fragile. 3 pages written on one side only. Nadine smoothed the pages carefully and began to read. To whoever has come to this house with the intention of staying, my name is Friedrich Ernst Wingate. I built this house in 1943 with my hands and with the hands of 2 good men from this town. I was a watchmaker. It was what I knew how to do better than anything else. The letter described what Rosalind did not know. Friedrich had not retired when he moved to the hills. For 23 years from 1948 until his eyes failed him, he had worked in the masonry room behind the kitchen door. He had collected 87 pocket watches from the 19th century, the finest European makers purchased from collectors who needed money from heirs, who did not know what they possessed from auctions in New York. He attended once a year telling the family he was visiting a cousin. He had repaired every piece, documented every one in 12 notebooks, hidden it because a German immigrant in the 1940s should not display wealth because his daughter would have sold the collection for a fraction of its value, and because he believed the right moment for what he had built had not yet arrived. The letter ended, "Take care of this house, it has good bones." Nadine read it 3 times. On the third reading, she noticed her hands were trembling. She stopped. She took the brass key, walked to the metal door, and inserted it. The lock opened without resistance. The door swung outward on a hinge that had been oiled well enough to last half a century. The air that came out was different from the rest of the house, dry, slightly warm, and the smell of machine oil concentrated pure without the wood and moisture mixed in. She found the switch on the wall, a black Bakelite toggle. A tungsten filament bulb came to life in the center of the ceiling, casting warm yellow light over the interior. A solid wood workbench ran the length of the center of the room, an iron vise clamped to the right end. A swing arm lamp frozen in the position Friedrich had left it in 1969. On the bench, arranged with a precision that seemed impossible after 50 years of stillness, were the tools. Fine-tipped pliers lined up by size, miniature screwdrivers of different widths, watchmaker's loops with turned wooden handles, steel tweezers standing in the order that reflected the logic of the man who had placed them there, the logic of someone who believed that where you put a tool is a statement about who you are. On the walls, floor-to-ceiling shelves held rows of individual wooden boxes, each with a handwritten label in German, each bearing a 3-digit number. Nadine counted them later, 87. She found the cabinet described in the letter. The drawer opened with the second key, which she discovered attached by a thin wire to the inside of the wooden box she had found in the kitchen cabinet and carried upstairs without knowing why. Inside the drawer, a cardboard folder tied with a leather cord. She brought it to the workbench and untied it. Provenance documents for each watch numbered 001 through 087 with dates of acquisition, prices paid, condition at purchase, restoration work performed, and value estimates made by Friedrich in 1969. She opened box 001. Inside, resting on green velvet, was a pocket watch with a gold case. She lifted it carefully. It was heavier than she had anticipated, the dense weight of precious metal and precision mechanics combined. She opened the front cover with her thumb. White dial slightly yellowed at the edges. Roman numerals, steel blue hands preserved in the dark blue that heat treatment gives to metal. On the inside of the back cover, an engraved gear, and below it, in very small letters, Patek Philippe Genève. The watch was not running. It had stopped at some point between 1969 and now with no one to wind it. But it was intact, no scratches, no damage. The hands in their place, a mechanism waiting for someone to ask it to move again. A tear fell on the back of Nadine's hand. She had not anticipated this. She had expected surprise. She had expected relief, perhaps the vertigo of large numbers. She had not expected this specific kind of weeping that arrives when you understand completely and all at once that during all the years you believed yourself alone, there was someone you never met in a room you never entered, building something for a future that had no face. Friedrich did not know her. He had been dead for 50 years. He had built for the possibility of someone like her without knowing if that someone would ever come. She placed the watch on the workbench with the care of a surgeon setting down an instrument. Then she folded her arms on the bench, lowered her head onto them, and wept in a way she had not wept since the night she arrived at Maureen's house with her suitcase and her $18,000. But this was different. That crying had been the release of loss. This was something else, something that has no precise name in any language she knew. The crying of when a weight you had forgotten you were carrying finally touches the ground. When she raised her head, she did not know how much time had passed. The tungsten bulb still burned. The 87 boxes still stood on their shelves. The tools still waited in their line. Then came the fear. It arrived without warning, the way fear does when it has been waiting behind a larger emotion. She sat in Friedrich's chair, the low wooden seat with its cracked leather, and thought, what if the watches were not authentic? What if the provenance documents were fabricated by a lonely old man who wanted to believe his collection was more than it was? What if someone came forward with a legal claim? She had lost everything once before. Her body remembered the way that felt. The signing of papers in a room that smelled of copy toner. The suitcase, the back bedroom. Her hands were shaking as she placed the Patek Philippe back in its box. She did not sleep that night. She lay on the mattress pad and the dark eyes open, and for the first time since arriving, she asked herself the question she'd been avoiding. Am I wrong about this too? In the morning, she carried Friedrich's black notebook to the front step and sat in the early light. She did not read the provenance entries or the valuation estimates. She turned instead to the margins where Friedrich had written notes to himself in a hand that grew smaller and more careful as the pages progressed. Sketches of gear mechanisms. A date August 12th, 1941, written sideways in a narrow margin, which she would later learn was Rosalind's birthday. And on one page, 3 words written with heavier pen pressure than anything else in the notebook, as though the man had been pressing the truth into the paper itself. Geduld, Geduld, Geduld. Patience. She would learn the word from Rosalind on a subsequent visit, but she understood its meaning already sitting on the step of a house she had owned for less than a month, holding a dead man's notebook, feeling the hillside air on her face. She closed the notebook. She made a decision. She would verify everything step by step with the careful discipline she had applied to every problem she had ever faced. And she would not be afraid. Jolene Travers made the call that changed everything. Her niece worked at an auction house in the city, and when Jolene mentioned over a family dinner that the woman who had bought the Wingate house had found something unusual in the back room, the niece mentioned it to a colleague who mentioned it to Prescott Hargrove. Prescott was 52, based in Los Angeles, and he specialized in antique timepieces from the 18th and 19th centuries. When he arrived on a Friday in April, driving a rental car with a leather briefcase and professional loop equipment, Nadine met him at the front door and led him through the house without commentary. She had learned in the weeks since finding the collection that the best way to present something extraordinary was to let it speak for itself. Prescott stepped through the metal door into the workshop and stopped. He stood in the threshold for approximately 5 seconds, his eyes moving across the shelves, the workbench, the tools in their line, the 87 numbered boxes. Then he said very quietly, "My God." He moved along the shelves, slowly opening boxes one by one, lifting each watch with white cotton gloves from his briefcase, examining through the loop, returning each piece with the same deliberate care. He did not speak much. He murmured sometimes half phrases in English that Nadine did not try to interpret. At one box, he paused longer than the others. He opened the case, then the back, exposing the movement, and examined it through the loop for nearly a minute. When he lowered the glass and looked at Nadine, there was in his face an expression she had never seen on a specialist. Not the controlled assessment of a professional performing an evaluation, but the open, unguarded face of a man confronting something that exceeded what he had prepared himself to find. "Do you know what you have here?" he said. "I have some idea. You don't." He said it gently with complete respect. "This piece I'm holding is a Vacheron Constantin from 1887, platinum case with Champlevé enamel, one of 12 known in the world. The last one to appear at auction was at Sotheby's Geneva in 2018. It went in with an estimate of 180,000 Swiss francs. A pause. It was hammered at 320,000, and that is one of the middle-tier pieces in this collection." They stayed in the room until 6 in the evening. Prescott photographed every piece, took notes on the provenance documents, asked about Friedrich's history. At the end, he removed his gloves, closed his briefcase, and sat in the watchmaker's chair. "I need to be honest with you," he said. "A formal appraisal requires a second specialist from another firm to avoid conflict of interest. But based on what I've seen today, I can give you an approximate figure." He looked at Nadine. "Between $2 and $3 million at current valuation, probably closer to 2.5. Nadine nodded slowly. She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. Then she said, "There's something else." She opened Friedrich's notebook to a page she had marked with a strip of craft paper. A hand-drawn plot map, the 2-acre property with the house at its center, and an annotation in German in the northeast section that Rosalind had translated for her northeast section. "Firm ground, natural plateau with clear view to the horizon. Construction possible. Verify with engineer. 1965. Prescott looked at the map. He looked at Nadine. "Do you have a reliable real estate agent?" "I have one who isn't reliable, but I can find a better one." He smiled. "You're going to need a better one." Genevieve Hathaway was 40, based in San Francisco, and she specialized in hillside properties along the coastal region. She arrived 15 days after Prescott's visit with a surveying engineer and a drone that covered the property for 2 hours, while Genevieve measured and noted with an efficiency that Nadine observed in silence. At the end of the day, seated at the plastic kitchen table with topographic maps spread between the coffee cups, Genevieve delivered her assessment. The total area was just over 2 acres. The northeast section, the plateau Friedrich had noted in 1965, was approximately half an acre of flat ground, with access from the hillside and an unobstructed frontal view to the horizon. "This entire property as it stands," Genevieve said, pausing the way people do when choosing the next words with precision, "is worth approximately $2 million. There is a developer from San Francisco who has been acquiring hillside parcels in this area for 2 years. They offered just over $2 million for a smaller lot 200 yards down the other side of the hill." She looked at Nadine. "If you wanted to sell, I could broker it." "I don't want to sell," Nadine said. "Then you need to know that this property, combined with the collection, represents a total net worth of between $4 and $5 million. Nadine, who had arrived with $62,000 spent and $33,000 in her pocket, who had slept on a $25 mattress pad on the floor of a room with broken windows, who had eaten the best breakfast of 3 years at a plastic table under an oak tree, because she had found a good baker in a town where she knew no one looked at the topographic maps for a moment. "Can I get you more coffee?" she said. It took exactly 4 months for the news to reach Garrison Ashford. But before Garrison called, someone else came to the door first, and that person was not interested in pocket watches. Quentin Caulfield drove a black SUV with tinted windows up the dirt road on a Wednesday morning in June, parked at the curve where every visitor parked, and stepped out wearing leather shoes that had no business being on unpaved ground. He was 55, silver-haired, clean-shaven, and carried himself with the physical confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades entering rooms where the outcome was already decided in his favor. He wore no tie, but his shirt was pressed with the kind of crease that costs money, and when he smiled at Nadine from the bottom of the stone path, the smile had the polished warmth of something rehearsed in a mirror until it looked natural. Nadine was on the porch with a cup of coffee and Friedrich's notebook. She had been reading a passage in the margins about the tensile strength of mainsprings and Swiss movements, not because she understood the mechanics, but because Friedrich's handwriting in those technical sections became smaller and more deliberate, as though the precision of the subject demanded a matching precision from the pen. She closed the notebook when she heard the car door. "Mrs. Bancroft." The man was already climbing the stone path. "Quentin Caulfield, Coastal Ridge Development. I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Nadine said, "but come in, I'll make coffee." They sat at the kitchen table, which was no longer the plastic garden table from her first weeks, but a second-hand oak table Jolene had found at an estate sale in town, sturdy with ring marks from decades of mugs and the particular warmth that wood acquires from long use. Quentin placed a leather folder on the table and opened it to reveal a printed offer sheet, a site map of the surrounding hillside, and 3-color photographs of resort developments his company had built along the coast. "We've been acquiring properties in this area for 2 years, he said, gesturing at the site map where several parcels were shaded in blue. "Your land sits between two of our existing holdings. It's the centerpiece of a planned resort development and that would bring significant economic activity to this town." He slid the offer sheet toward her. $2.4 million for the full property, including the house. Well above market value. You won't find a better offer. Nadine looked at the number. She looked at the site map, at the blue-shaded parcels surrounding her land on 3 sides. She understood the geometry immediately. Without her property, Caulfield's project had a gap in its center. He needed her land the way a watchmaker needs the mainspring. Everything else was assembled. The essential piece was missing. "I'm not looking for an offer, Mr. Caulfield," she said. "I'm not selling." Quentin's smile did not change, but something behind it recalibrated. "Mrs. Bancroft, I understand the emotional attachment. You've done beautiful work with this house. But $2.4 million is a life-changing number." "My life has already changed," Nadine said. "That's why I'm here." He left that day without the signature he had come for. He returned the following week with a revised proposal. $2.6 million, structured to allow Nadine to retain the house and a third of an acre surrounding it while selling the remainder of the land. "You keep the museum," he said, using the word with an emphasis that made clear he considered it quaint. "We develop around you." Nadine looked at him across the oak table. "Mr. Caulfield, this property is not land. It's the place where Friedrich Wingate planted agapanthus in 1940 with the intention that they would remain here permanently. I have the same intention." "Everyone reconsiders when the number is large enough," Quentin said. "I spent 43 years with a man who specialized in telling me what I was getting to think," Nadine said. "I don't reconsider." Quentin Caulfield left, But the following week, a letter arrived from the law offices of a firm in San Francisco representing Coastal Ridge Development, requesting clarification of property boundaries and asserting potential questions regarding a right-of-way access easement along the northern edge of Nadine's land. The language was polite, the intent was not. Nadine had spent enough years watching Garrison's lawyers operate to recognize a strategy. It was not a legal threat. It was a shake of the tree to see what fell. She set the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it for a full minute. Then she picked up her phone and called Genevieve Hathaway. I need a real estate attorney, a good one, not a cheap one. The attorney, a woman named Suzette Caldwell from a firm Genevieve recommended, reviewed the deed and the original land survey within a week and confirmed what Nadine had suspected. The boundaries were clear, the title was clean, and the claimed right-of-way had no legal basis. Coastal Ridge withdrew their inquiry quietly. Quentin Caulfield did not come back. When Nadine told Jolene about it over their Wednesday afternoon coffee beneath the oak tree, Jolene said, "He'll buy the land around you instead. You'll be an island in the middle of his resort." Nadine looked at her. Friedrich was an island in the middle of a country that distrusted him for 30 years. He still went to his workbench every morning. "I think I can manage." Garrison Ashford called on a July afternoon. Nadine was sitting on the porch step, the step she had sanded and refinished herself the previous month, watching the late light on the garden where Mr. Fairbanks had coaxed the Japanese camellia into its first white blooms. The phone showed the number she had saved as "Do Not Answer." She answered anyway. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps the specific need to hear the chapter close from the correct direction. "Nadine." The voice was unchanged, deep assured, the voice of a man who had always known how to occupy the acoustic space of any room he entered, even through a phone. "We need to talk." "About what, Garrison?" "I've heard some things about your situation up there." A pause waited with calculation. "That settlement was signed with incomplete information. You had interests in assets that weren't disclosed during the proceedings, and that changes the legal picture." Nadine watched a hummingbird hovering at the jasmine Mr. Fairbanks had pruned back from the wall. It hung in the air with an effort that looked effortless, wings blurring, holding its position against the wind with a precision that suggested the air itself was cooperating. "Garrison, are you trying to claim a share of property I purchased with my own money? A full year after a divorce, you initiated property that appeared in no inventory because it did not exist when the agreement was signed." Silence. "Any attorney you hire will tell you the same thing, but you're welcome to try. It's going to cost you." She let the silence sit for a moment. "Take care of the Riverside Heights house. Goodbye, Garrison." She ended the call. She set the phone on the porch railing and watched the hummingbird finish at the jasmine and dart uphill toward the tree line. She sat for a while longer, feeling something she had not expected to feel. After hearing Garrison's voice, nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even the cold clarity of vindication. Just the quiet awareness that the person on the other end of that call no longer had the power to change the temperature in the room. Garrison came in person in August. Without warning, Nadine was in the garden with Mr. Fairbanks wearing a straw hat and gloves, pruning a branch of jasmine that had crept back over the wall when she heard a car on the road. She did not recognize the vehicle, but she recognized the way the door closed, the way the shoes hit the gravel, the way the figure walked up the stone path with shoulders set slightly back. She had observed that walk for 43 years. He looked different from what she had prepared herself for. Thinner, hair completely gray, without the physical authority that had defined him through his entire adult life. He seemed diminished in some way, though she knew his actual dimensions had not changed. "Nadine," he said, stopping at the entrance to the stone path. She removed one glove. Mr. Fairbanks beside her continued working on the camellia, with the focused attention of a man who knew precisely when to be occupied. "May I come in?" Garrison said. She had not been asked that question by him in 43 years. He had walked into every room of her life without asking: bedrooms, decisions, bank accounts, the future itself. This was the first place that was entirely hers, built with her own hands and her own money, owing nothing to any history they had shared. The question mattered. "You may," she said. "I'll make coffee." They sat in the wicker chairs on the porch, the chairs she had bought in May, positioned to face the garden. The porch floor gleamed with the varnish she had applied in 3 careful coats. The magnolia Mr. Fairbanks had liberated from the vines stood at the center of the garden, with its canopy open, white flowers catching the afternoon light. Garrison looked at the house. He looked at the garden. He looked at the carved wooden sign beside the front door that Dalton had made the watchmaker's museum. Café Wingate. Nadine watched his face and saw exactly what she expected. Not recognition, not admiration, calculation. He was performing an appraisal the way he had always appraised places, people, and possibilities, measuring what could be extracted. "It turned out beautiful," he said. "It did. I heard about the watch collection. I figured you would. And the land." The wind carried the scent of jasmine. Garrison leaned forward in the wicker chair, his elbows on his knees, and spoke in the voice Nadine knew as his negotiation register, lower, softer, the voice of a man who believed he was managing a conversation he controlled. "Nadine, I know things got ugly. The divorce wasn't what I wanted." She said nothing. "But 43 years count for something. You built this alone, I know that. But there's a history, a shared past. That has to mean something." Nadine picked up her coffee mug from the porch railing and held it in both hands. She did not drink. She held it the way you hold something warm, when you need a moment to choose your words, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the weight of what you are about to say. "The agreement was signed," she said. "I filed no action to reverse it, though I had more than sufficient grounds. Do you know what those grounds were? You kept the house, you kept the assets, you kept the sewing money. I had put into the joint account over 2 decades. You kept everything I helped build. This house I bought with what was left after you kept everything. This land I found myself. This collection I discovered because I walked into a house nobody wanted and stayed when anyone else would have left." She looked at him directly. "There is no shared history here, Garrison. This history is mine alone." He was quiet for a long time. She watched his face and saw the passage of several things in quick succession, the calculation that did not add up, the anger that rose and subsided, and then beneath those, something she had not anticipated finding. Something that might have been the beginning of shame. Not the shame of being caught, which she had seen before, but the harder, slower shame of a man who is 68 years old and sitting on the porch of a house his ex-wife built with $33,000, and her bare hands understanding for the first time that he is looking at the evidence of what she was capable of all along, and that the evidence indicts him. "I was very unjust," he said. His voice was different from every voice he had used before, stripped of performance, quiet in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. Nadine looked at him and saw for the first time not an adversary, but an aging man confronting a portrait of himself that he did not want to examine. She did not feel pity, but she recognized something in his expression that was genuine honesty, arriving late, insufficient, but real. "Yes," she said, "you were." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had preceded it. It was the silence of when there is nothing more to add, not because the conversation has been forcibly closed, but because it has arrived at the place where things are what they are and do not change their names. Garrison stayed another 15 minutes. He drank his coffee. He looked at the house once more when he stood to leave. At the entrance to the stone path, he turned. "Are you well?" he said, and he seemed to say it with a kind of relief that surprised even him. "I am," she said. He walked to the car, got in, and drove away. Mr. Fairbanks appeared at her side with 2 mugs of coffee, handed her one without speaking. They drank, looking at the garden. It was a good silence. The Watchmakers Museum opened on October 22, 2020, a Thursday of white October sunlight with 43 people present. Neighbors, visitors. Prescott Hargrove had brought from Los Angeles. Rosalind Wingate in the chair of honor, wearing a linen dress she had saved for a special occasion, her blue eyes bright behind the thick lenses. Jolene Travers beside her with a new apron and a table of pastries that included apple hand pies, made from a recipe Rosalind had dictated from memory, cinnamon rolls, adapted from Friedrich's wife Winifred's original method, and a cream-filled pastry Jolene had developed specifically for the opening. Maureen Driscoll had come from Monterey by bus, arriving the night before, and had spent the morning of the opening in the kitchen with Jolene, operating at a level of mutual understanding that Nadine observed with a joy she had not anticipated, the joy of watching two people you love discover that they like each other without your involvement. The house had been restored. Not restored in the sense of made new, which Nadine had learned was a different thing entirely. The Art Deco wallpaper remained clean and consolidated, but unchanged, with the marks of time visible as part of what the house was. The hardwood floor, waxed and warm, still creaked in the same places it had always creaked. The carved mantelpiece stood at the center of everything, the object that condensed the entire story into a single piece of oak. The workshop had been transformed into an exhibition space. The shelves with their 87 boxes remained illuminated now by a strip of warm light Prescott had helped install. Friedrich's workbench was preserved exactly as it had been found. The tools in their line, the iron vise, the swing arm lamp. Above the bench, a text panel in English and German that Nadine had written herself, telling Friedrich's story in short, precise paragraphs. 12 watches were on permanent display, selected by Prescott for their documented histories and condition. The remaining 75 were in a climate-controlled bank vault. Nadine had sold 3 pieces in September, chosen by Prescott, with criteria she had approved one by one, for a total that covered the entire renovation, the museum installation, and the cafe setup, and left a reserve that, for the first time in Nadine's life, contained enough zeros to eliminate anxiety. Café Wingate occupied the main living room, small tables with natural linen cloths, cobalt blue ceramics Jolene had selected from a pottery studio, wooden chairs with woven seats that Dalton had recovered from a local antique shop. On the wall, where the rectangular picture marks had remained since Nadine's first day, she had placed in large black and white photographs. Friedrich at his city workshop in the 1940s looped to his eye. Winifred on the porch of the first hillside house, smiling at a camera that was probably Friedrich's. A child standing in the garden with agapanthus blooming behind her, proof that the purple flowers had been there since before 1945. And a photograph of Nadine taken by Maureen on the day she first opened the metal door, showing Nadine from behind standing before the shelves, the warm tungsten light illuminating the 87 boxes around her. No caption beneath it. None was needed. Rosalind opened the ceremony with 3 paragraphs she had written by hand on cream stationery and read in a thin but unwavering voice. My grandfather Friedrich Ernst Wingate believed that good things need time to be ready. He said that a watch running incorrectly does not lie. It only runs slow. And the solution is never to discard the watch, but to have the patience to understand what is wrong and correct it. She paused, looking at the paper through her glasses. This house waited 80 years for the right person. My grandfather would have approved of the wait. When it was Nadine's turn, she stood before the 43 people for a moment before speaking. She looked at the walls, the wallpaper, the photographs, the light coming through the clean windows at the angle that seemed intentional. I arrived here with a suitcase, she said, and $33,000 in my pocket. Everyone I knew thought I was wrong. The whole town called this house cursed. She stopped. I was not wrong, and the house was never cursed. She said nothing more. There was nothing more to say that the house itself was not already saying in every cleaned wall and varnished floor and numbered box on its green velvet shelf. In March of 2021, exactly 1 year since Nadine had stepped off the bus with her suitcase, Rosalind placed in her hands a second envelope. It was a Tuesday afternoon on the porch, their weekly coffee, and Rosalind withdrew it from her leather bag with fingers that moved more slowly each month, but had lost none of their deliberateness. The envelope was smaller than the first, with Rosalind's name written on the front in a different hand, feminine and slanted. "This is from my mother," Rosalind said. "Corinne Schwein. She left it to me in 1983 with one instruction: give it to whomever I judge to be the right person for this house at the right moment." She looked at Nadine over her glasses. "I believe this is the moment." Inside, a sheet of paper folded in four and a safe deposit box key with the number 447 engraved on its side. Corinne's note, written in 1983, said that Friedrich had opened the box in 1965 and renewed it every year until his death. Corinne had continued renewing it because she did not know what was inside and had not had the courage to open it. The next morning, Nadine and Rosalind went together to the local bank. Safe deposit box 447 was one of the larger sizes. Nadine carried it to the private room and set it on the table. Rosalind stood beside her. The bank manager, out of tact, stepped out and closed the door. Inside was a bundle of papers held with an old rubber band, a letter of 5 pages in Friedrich's precise hand, and a folded leather strap that Nadine recognized before she had fully unfolded it. A pocket watch chain, the kind worn with a vest with a gold hook at one end. The letter was dated 1968, 3 years before Friedrich's death. Nadine read it aloud for Rosalind. Friedrich described a correspondence he had begun in 1957 with a watchmaker in Zurich named Helmut Bauer, who had seen Friedrich's work at an exhibition in New York and offered him a contract to perform restorations for the private collections of 3 Swiss families. The work arrived by mail. Payment was deposited into a Swiss account in Friedrich's name. For 11 years, every restoration was completed in the workshop behind the metal door. Friedrich spent none of the money. He did not know what to do with it that would not be wrong. In 1965, he consulted a lawyer in San Francisco who helped him establish a trust linked to the property funded by the Zurich payments and invested in conservative instruments. "I do not know what the trust is worth today," Friedrich had written. In 1968, its value was $142,000. With the interest of the years, it must be more. The letter continued. "About the leather strap, it belongs to my Patek Philippe of 1882. When I purchased the watch, the strap was damaged, and I set it aside while I sourced new leather. I never completed the repair. Keep this chain with the watch. They belong together." And then the final paragraph. "I had a good life, Corinne. The best of it was on this hillside with your mother and with you and Gertrude. The horizon seen from the window of the small room is worth more than everything on those shelves." Rosalind was crying without sound when Nadine finished reading. The tears moved along the lines of her face with the naturalness of water following its oldest path. No shame, no performance. The crying of a woman who is 83 and has earned every tear. Nadine folded the letter carefully, placed it on the table, and took the leather chain from the box. She held it in her palm. The leather was dry but intact, the gold hook still bright. She put it in her pocket. The attorney in San Francisco took 3 weeks to assess the trust documents. When he called, Nadine was in the garden with Mr. Fairbanks planting a new bed of lavender along the south side of the house. "Ms. Bancroft," the attorney said, in the measured voice of a man about to deliver a significant number, "the trust with accumulated returns since 1968 currently stands at approximately $840,000. Nadine held the phone to her ear and looked at the lavender. Mr. Fairbanks was setting into the soil with the steady rhythm of a man who had done this 1,000 times and intended to do it 1,000 more. "Understood," she said. "Next week we'll discuss how to operate the trust." She hung up. Mr. Fairbanks looked at her from where he knelt in the dirt. "Everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Mr. Fairbanks. The lavender looks good there." He nodded and went back to planting. Nadine stood watching him for a moment, watching the way his hands packed the soil around each root firm, but not rough, the gesture of a man who understood that what you are planting today is a promise to a future you may not see. She thought of Friedrich, not for the first time, and not for the last. Two men separated by decades, both planning things meant to outlast them, both quiet about it. The new life had a rhythm. Nadine built the way she had built everything, without hurry, without drama, with the attentiveness things deserve. She woke at 6:30. The corner window of her bedroom stayed open through the night now that the weather had softened, and the sound of wind in the trees reached her before the alarm, which made waking something fundamentally different from what it had been for decades. Not the interruption of rest, but the continuation of something that had been happening while she slept. Deirdre Pemberton arrived with a printed resume and a passion for horology that startled Nadine with its specificity. She was 25, a history student who had written her senior thesis on immigrant craftsmen in the American West without knowing this collection existed. The coincidence struck them both as the kind of thing that happens when a place has finished waiting and is ready to be found. Deirdre led guided tours with a competence Nadine sometimes observed from the workshop doorway, explaining mechanisms with a vocabulary that came naturally to her, answering children's questions with the same seriousness she gave to scholars. Jolene closed the Hillside Bakery and opened Café Wingate in the main room, with a menu built from recipes Rosalind dictated from memory on Tuesday afternoons. The apple spice pastry Friedrich had ordered every Friday. The cinnamon rolls that had been Winifred's contribution to every holiday meal. A food and travel blog covered the cafe in December, and the resulting wave of weekend visitors surprised both women, not unpleasantly, but with the sudden need to adapt. Jolene called a niece to help. Nadine hired a second guide. In the afternoons, when the museum traffic slowed and Deirdre could manage alone, Nadine returned to quilting, not out of necessity, out of choice. The sewing room was the small upstairs bedroom, the one with the corner window fitted with a work table Dalton had built to measure, and a new machine she had purchased in September, with the specific satisfaction of a woman who knows exactly what she is buying and why. She had started a new quilt in November. Not to sell, though Jolene had received 3 requests from Café customers. This one was for herself. She was using pieces from specific places in specific moments. A square cut from Maureen's apron, given with a laugh. A piece of the navy blouse she had worn on the day she first saw the house with Emmett Lockhart. A fragment of linen from grandmother Imogene's embroidered tablecloth, which Rosalind had placed in her hands on a Tuesday afternoon, with a simplicity that made the gesture larger than ceremony. And there was a piece of green velvet, cut from a corner of the shelving in the workshop, where there was enough that it would not be missed. The velvet that had held Friedrich's watches for decades. The velvet that had waited. For weeks, the green velvet sat on the work table, while Nadine turned the possibilities in her mind, waiting for the right placement to reveal itself. She tried it at the border. She tried it at a corner. Nothing held. Then one afternoon in late March, with the light from the corner window falling across the work table in a way that turned the velvet surface from dark green to something almost luminous, she understood. The green velvet belonged at the center. It was the piece from which everything else radiated. Maureen's apron, the navy blouse, Imogene's tablecloth, and all the other pieces still to come from all the places still ahead. She sat at the machine, positioned the velvet, and began to sew. Mr. Fairbanks appeared in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been standing there. He watched her work for a moment, his arms crossed, his expression carrying the particular stillness of a man observing something he recognizes. "You know what I think," he said. "What?" "That German fellow and you. Same kind of people. He fixed watches. You fix fabric. He was patient for 23 years. You were patient for 43. Different materials. Same principle." Nadine looked at him. 68 years old, widower. Soil permanently embedded beneath his fingernails. A man who had shown up one Monday with a shovel and stayed without being asked the way certain people do when they recognize that what is needed is not an invitation, but simply someone willing to begin. "You too, Mr. Fairbanks," she said. "You're the same kind." He nodded, once turned and went back down to the garden. Nothing more needed to be said. There was a bench now in the northeast corner of Nadine's garden, built of old growth wood, that Mr. Fairbanks had insisted on because it lasts longer. It faced the open hillside where the land dropped away, and nothing stood between the garden and the sky. From this bench, the horizon was not a fragment, glimpsed through branches and over rooftops as it was from the corner window. It was the whole thing, open, uninterrupted gray-blue in the morning and gold in the afternoon, stretching from one edge of vision to the other. Every morning after coffee, before the museum opened and the first visitor's car climbed the dirt road, Nadine sat on that bench for half an hour, sometimes with the navy mug, sometimes with her hands open in her lap, sometimes with Friedrich's black notebook, which she still read from time to time, not because she needed to, but because there was something in the trace of his small, precise handwriting that felt on certain mornings almost like a conversation with a man she had never met, but understood. The house that the whole town had called cursed now had a restored wooden facade that caught the morning sun. Windows with clean glass through which light entered at angles that seemed intentional. A garden tended by a man who planted for permanence, and a carved wooden plaque beside the front door made by a 32-year-old carpenter who had stood in silence before 72 wooden gear teeth and recognized the work of a master across 80 years of time. On a morning in April, Nadine was sitting on the bench with her coffee when her phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. She answered. "Mrs. Bancroft." The voice was male, accented, careful with English in a way that suggested it was a second language handled with respect. "My name is Sterling Bauer. I am the grandson of Helmut Bauer from Zurich. I had been going through my grandfather's papers, and I found his correspondence with Friedrich Wingate. Many letters, spanning 11 years. Nadine set her coffee on the arm of the bench. "There is also a watch," Sterling Bauer continued. "A pocket watch that Friedrich completed a restoration on in 1968 and shipped back to my grandfather. But my grandfather never returned it to the client. He kept it. He wrote in his journal that the work Friedrich had done on this piece was the finest he had ever seen, and that the watch belonged with Friedrich, not with the family who had commissioned the repair." A pause. She could hear him breathing, choosing his next words. "The watch has been in my grandfather's estate for 58 years, Mrs. Bancroft. I would like to bring it to you. I believe it belongs in that house." Nadine looked at the horizon, the full horizon open, unbroken gray, blue becoming gold as the sun climbed. She thought of Friedrich in his workshop in 1968, packaging a watch he had spent months restoring, shipping it across an ocean, believing his work was finished. She thought of Helmut Bauer receiving that package, opening the case, examining the movement, and making a decision that no contract or obligation required to keep the watch not for himself, but for the man who had made it perfect. A decision made in silence across 6,000 miles between two craftsmen who understood that certain things once completed belonged not to whoever paid for them, but to whoever gave them their finest hour. "Come whenever you like, Mr. Bauer," Nadine said. "The house is open every day." She ended the call. She picked up her coffee. It had gone lukewarm, but she drank it anyway. The 88th watch was on its way. Friedrich's collection, which he had believed complete at 87, was about to receive a piece he never knew would return to him, carried across an ocean and half a century by the grandson of a man who had recognized genius when he held it in his hands. Nadine sat on the bench and watched the horizon change color. Behind her, the house stood on the hillside the way it had stood for 80 years, with its good bones and its green velvet and its carved clock frozen at 3:20, the oak mantelpiece that a man had shaped on a Christmas night in 1945, kneeling before a fireplace with a chisel while a 4-year-old girl watched from the doorway. Inside the upstairs sewing room on the work table beside the corner window, a quilt was taking shape. At its center, a square of green velvet. Around it, pieces from every place and every person that had brought Nadine to this hillside. Maureen's apron, the navy blouse, Imogene's tablecloth, and empty spaces waiting for the pieces still to come because the quilt, like the collection, like the garden, like the life Nadine was building at 65 on a hill, the whole town had feared was not finished. It was not supposed to be finished. The best things Friedrich had written in the margin of his notebook, pressing the words deep into the paper, need time to be ready. Geduld, patience. Nadine Bancroft had plenty of that.